We're ready to start the afternoon session, and we have two outstanding authors who've written a lot about this topic, and particularly about President Dwight Eisenhower, who had the enormous task in the 1950s of being the president, both when Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, but more critically, the president during the Little Rock 9 issue in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And to share some of their thoughts about it, first Jim Newton, who's the editor-at-large of the Los Angeles Times. He's also a member of the Times editorial board and advises on editorial matters and writes and edits for the editorial page and op-ed page. He's been there for over 20 years, and he also spent time working with both the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and as a clerk at the New York Times. He's also a well-known author, and among his books are Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made, as well as Eisenhower, The White House Years, two of his classic books. And he'll be speaking to you about Dwight Eisenhower at Little Rock 9 and the town of Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1950s. Please welcome Jim Newton.
Well, thank you all very much. My mother always wanted me to go to Harvard Law School, so her dreams come true today. Thank you all for being here. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be part of this gathering. Hearing from the Little Rock 9 this morning is something that I will certainly never forget. And I very much look forward to this afternoon and hearing my dear friend Erwin Chemerinsky argue. Before I started, I wanted to thank Professor Ogletree for the invitation to be here today, and also my good friend Dave Nichols for his continuing pursuit of trying to understand Dwight Eisenhower. Dave and I see some aspects of Eisenhower's record on civil rights differently. He'll obviously speak for himself, but I think it's safe to say that his read of Ike is somewhat more positive than mine on this issue. I see Eisenhower on civil rights as fundamentally cautious and blindered about the issue, and yet drawn over and over to the right results by a style of leadership that allowed him to overcome his weaknesses. As a result, I think Dave and I will agree more often than not on the bottom line, that Eisenhower played an important role in advancing civil rights, whatever his motives or impulses. I think we'll also agree that Eisenhower's record is highlighted, largely contained by three areas. His judicial appointments, what I call his executive actions, principally his support of the Civil Rights Bill in 1957, and his work to desegregate institutions under his control, principally the military. And then finally, of course, the main event that we're here to talk about today, and that's his decision to use troops to enforce desegregation in Little Rock. Together, those moves improved the law, they affirmed the constitutionality of the cause of civil rights, and they made clear eventually that defiance would not be tolerated. All of that is to Eisenhower's undying credit. I would argue, though, that they were not motivated by his embrace of the cause of civil rights or his conviction that desegregation was a matter of national or moral urgency. Rather, they were the result of other forces and impulses. Ike's deference to subordinates in matters where he felt personally unsure, his gradualism, his belief in the fundamental goodness of the American people, black and white, and his absolute understanding of the use of military force and the threat of insurrection. You'll hear in just a minute, because I'm about to tell you, some offensive remarks made by Ike on the subject of race, or an offensive remark. But let me be clear. I do not believe that Eisenhower was racist. He was instead a product of his upbringing, which did little to expose him prior to the presidency or even during the presidency to the struggles of African Americans. He was born in 1890. He was the last president born in the 19th century. He was born in segregated Texas. He was raised in segregated Kansas. He attended segregated West Point, and he rose to the pinnacle of influence in a segregated army. Moreover, he felt a real kinship with the South and identified with white Southerners who feared that desegregating schools would crack the kind of foundations of the culture that they believed so passionately in. Many of Eisenhower's closest associates were Southerners. Even his favorite golf course was Augusta, a segregated golf course. Those influences combined to create in Eisenhower a profound ambivalence about how the country should address discrimination. And it meant that he often sent off some mixed signals. That was readily apparent in an infamous conversation that Eisenhower had with Earl Warren in early 1954. The occasion was one of Ike's stag dinners, so named because only men were invited. We won't get into his discrimination against women, but the event had barely begun before Warren was quite uncomfortable, and that's because Eisenhower seated him close to John W. Davis, who we heard about earlier from Professor Mack. John W. Davis, as he mentioned, was the lawyer for South Carolina in the Brown case and a famous segregationist. That wasn't the worst of it. And by the way, Warren was a sort of prickly character who was very sensitive to violations of propriety. So the fact that he was seated so close to Davis bothered him. And that, unfortunately, was not the worst of it. As the evening continued, Eisenhower at some point took Warren aside, and he gestured to the Southerners in the room and said this: "These are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big overgrown Negroes." Dave argues in his book that this wasn't an attempt to influence Warren on Brown, and I would agree. It's hard to imagine that such a sort of boorish remark would have any influence on Warren. And I also agree with Dave that the language is probably more offensive to our ear today than it would have been in 1954. But I also think that it's illustrative of Ike's orientation on this issue. He didn't instinctively see civil rights from the perspective of those who were suffering discrimination, but rather from those who were inflicting it. One additional note. Dave notes in his book that Warren may have misquoted Eisenhower, and that's, of course, possible. There was no other witness to this exchange. Warren put it in his memoirs, so he made Ike pay for it. That is possible, as I say, but it doesn't square with the recollection of another participant in this event, and that's Ike's political advisor and Attorney General Herb Brownell. Herb Brownell heard about the exchange later and tried to reconstruct the conversation. What he discovered is that Ike was mad at Warren not for misquoting him, but for violating the terms of these dinners, which is that they were off the record. Eisenhower's diaries and private conversations from the early 1950s also capture his uncertainty and his inner conflict about civil rights, and also about his reservations about for those who he felt were pushing the issue too far or too fast. Among other things, he fretted to himself and to close friends that the court might issue an order that the South would simply refuse to obey. And in that, of course, he was partly correct. Here are two diary entries from mid-1953. The first, he writes, "Improvement in race relations is one of those things that will be healthy and sound only if it starts locally. I do not believe that prejudices, even palpably unjustified prejudices, will succumb to compulsion." And a second, he writes, "I believe that federal law imposed upon our states in such a way as to bring about a conflict of the police powers of the states and of the nation would set back the cause of progress in race relations for a long, long time." I would submit that those are not the ruminations of a president who's eager to lead on this issue. Brown, of course, as you all know, and has been mentioned here already today, was decided on or handed down on May 17th of 1954. As written, the Brown opinion famously read and reads, quote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." But when Warren read it from the bench, he interposed a word: "We unanimously conclude." Warren understood the importance of the unanimity in this court. He wrote in his memoirs, "When the word unanimously was spoken, a wave of emotion swept the room. No words or intentional movement, yet a distinct emotional manifestation that defies description." It is safe to say that Eisenhower was not among those who was so moved. He could have welcomed Brown as a triumph of American egalitarianism. He could have welcomed it as applauded the work of his recently appointed Chief Justice, and shared in the responsibility for what many regard as the greatest Supreme Court opinion of the 20th century. He did not. Here was his response, given 2 days later at a press conference. "The Supreme Court has spoken, and I am sworn to uphold the constitutional processes in this country, and I will obey." Well, it's better to obey than disobey, obviously, but that's hardly the ringing endorsement that supporters of Brown, and certainly that Warren felt that they might have wished for. Moreover, Ike's uncertainty about Brown did not abate over time. In 1956, when the Republicans were preparing their platform language for the GOP convention to be held that year in San Francisco, the original draft said that the party and the Republican Party and the Eisenhower administration had, quote unquote, supported the Supreme Court on Brown. Ike rejected that language. In fact, he rejected it so sternly that he refused to go to San Francisco and attend the convention if that language was left in the platform. He also complained to Brownell, his attorney general at the time, that he felt Brown had set back the cause of civil rights. Curiously, he also insisted that the administration had never taken a stand on the issue. That's sort of weirdly untrue, because the Justice Department had, in fact, filed a brief that he had seen in support of desegregation. So the floor managers, faced with his rejection, tried again. This time they substituted language saying that the administration concurred in the ruling, and that was still not good enough for Eisenhower. Eventually, they settled on a passage saying that the administration accepts the ruling in Brown. With that, Ike said he could go, and off to San Francisco he went. And yet, it is the same Eisenhower who was capable of that crude remark to Warren, and the same Eisenhower who rejected the platform language, who was in some measure responsible for Brown. It is, after all, he who named Warren to the court, and it was Warren who not only wrote Brown, but delivered the unanimous court behind it, an outcome that would have been virtually inconceivable under his predecessor, Chief Justice Fred Vinson. So how is it possible that a man capable of that remark and capable of his position on the platform could also be responsible for the appointment of justices and judges who earnestly and sometimes quite bravely implemented Brown? My answer to that is in two parts. First is that Ike was a complicated man. No one knows better than Dave and I. Every time you think you've got something firm about Eisenhower, he surprises you with something else. And he was genuinely conflicted on this issue. And second is that his style of management inclined him toward trusting gifted subordinates. And in this case, he had the gifted subordinate to guide him through the confusion on this issue was Herb Brownell, who I've mentioned a couple of times. Brownell, for those of you who don't know, was a lawyer, an influential political figure in mid-century Republican politics. He had guided Tom Dewey's campaigns for president. Was a leading strategist for the moderate center of the Republican Party that Ike identified with and that sadly doesn't really exist anymore today. Brownell also ran Eisenhower's campaign, and Eisenhower trusted him implicitly on matters of domestic politics, in part because Eisenhower was conscious of his own shortcomings there. His whole background really was in diplomatic and military affairs. It was Brownell who identified judicial candidates for Ike, usually operating under a fairly broad mandate. And it was natural that Brownell would be an advocate for Warren. Warren had been Tom Dewey's running mate in 1948. Brownell knew him quite well, respected him greatly. And Eisenhower himself grew fond of the governor. Warren was governor of California at the time, after the GOP convention in 1952 when Ike beat him for the nomination, the Republican nomination. Eisenhower, of course, went on to win the general election that year. And considered Warren first for a position in his cabinet, ultimately completed his cabinet without naming Warren. But he instead told Warren, shortly after the election, before he was inaugurated, that Warren would get the first vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. When the vacancy occurred, however, Ike hesitated and didn't immediately offer to him. He had not intended to offer Warren the Chief Justiceship and had not expected that that would be the first vacancy. He even sounded out John Foster Dulles on the possibility of joining the court, an occasion that would have been of great and horrid consequence for the country. But Brownell urged him to stick with his promise to Warren, and eventually, of course, Warren did get the nomination that year. I should also emphasize that Brownell was not unsupervised by Ike when it came to spotting judicial candidates, as he vetted them. He did so with instructions from the president each time. After Warren, for instance, Eisenhower said he no longer wanted nominees who lacked bench experience. And when it came to filling Sherman Minton's seat in 1956, and it was an election year, Eisenhower specifically told Brownell he wanted four things: a conservative, a sitting judge, preferably a Democrat, and definitely a Catholic. He got William Brennan, which is to say he got roughly 3 out of 4 of those. One final note on Ike's Supreme Court appointees or nominees. They were quite varied. Warren and Brennan, of course, properly thought of as liberals, one a Republican, one a Democrat. John Harlan and Potter Stewart, appropriately thought of as conservatives. Only Charles Whitaker, I think, really wasn't up to the job, and he didn't last very long. And yet, every single one of those justices voted to uphold and extend Brown every single time it came before them. And moreover, the quality of those justices was matched by the quality of the district and appellate court judges who as I said earlier, really had to carry out the hard work of Brown of deciding what fulfilled the obligation of all deliberate speed. And they too, of course, were placed there by Eisenhower. So I think it's fair to ask, what's the difference if Eisenhower advanced the cause of civil rights because he believed strongly in it, or because he followed the lead of others? Indeed, I think that's part of Dave's premise, and it's valid. If Judge Ike by his actions, not his words, and you come away with a much more positive appraisal of his leadership on this issue. But the answer, I think, is that sometimes Ike's ambivalence had consequences. Indeed, one of the most profound consequences of his ambiguity on civil rights contributed to the Little Rock crisis that we're here today discussing. At a news conference on July 17th of 1957, just a few months before the Little Rock crisis, Eisenhower was specifically asked whether he had the authority to use military force to integrate schools. This is his answer. Well, first of all, lawyers have differed about some of these authorities of which you speak, but I have been informed by various lawyers that the power does exist. But I want to say this. I can't imagine any set of circumstances that would ever induce me to send federal troops into a federal court and into any area to enforce the orders of a federal court, because I believe that the common sense of America will never require it. You have to sort of cull through his syntax there, which was famously sort of dense. But what he seemed to be saying is that he believed he had a power that he would not use. That gave room for speculation that Southerners who resisted integration might be able to get away with it. And one who clearly took advantage of that was Orville Faubus. Now, you all have heard a much more vivid description of the Little Rock crisis this morning than I can possibly offer you. But let me just sketch out a few of the facts on it because I think they help illustrate where Eisenhower was coming from on it. For Faubus, thwarting desegregation was a political necessity. He was running for re-election. He had a challenge from his right. He'd been accused of being sort of soft in previous elections. In fact, he was accused of being a communist in one election, although many people don't know it. Orville Eugene Faubus, his full name being Orville Eugene Faubus, the Eugene in that was, his namesake was Eugene Debs, the famous American socialist. Faubus, recognizing this political challenge, mobilized the National Guard and directed it to block the students. We are so lucky to have some with us today. And with that, Ike was faced with a direct challenge to his authority as commander-in-chief. If a governor could use federal troops, National Guard, to thwart the orders of a federal court, then the rule of law as we know it was coming to an end. And I should note, Ike may not have been a great student at West Point. He wasn't. But he knew the history of the Civil War, and he understood the relationship between state and federal governments to a T. He also gravely grasped the implications of sending federal troops into a southern city. And so first, before doing so, he tried to negotiate his way through this crisis. Over Brownell's objections, incidentally, Eisenhower invited Faubus to join him at the military base, the naval base at Newport, Rhode Island, where he and Mamie were vacationing. Mamie was recovering from a hysterectomy. The two men talked informally at first. Faubus talked about having served under General Patton in World War II. I talked about having served over General Patton in World War II. And then they settled down to business. Faubus proposed that Ike essentially back off, that he grant a cooling off period, and that he give Faubus the use of federal marshals to help control order. This must have struck Ike as rich. We were in this situation because Faubus had used the National Guard to block the orders of court. Now he wanted federal marshals too. So instead, Ike countered with his own proposal that the Guard remain in place, but that Faubus change its orders from blocking the students from entering school to escorting and protecting them. He concluded with a very stern reminder to the governor. If the state defied the federal government, the state would lose. Well, Faubus left there initially seeming to have agreed, and then he dawdled and played for time, until finally on the night of September 20th, in the face of a clear order from the federal court not to obstruct, Faubus removed the National Guard from the streets of Little Rock. That was a Friday evening, and the nation spent a restless weekend. On Monday, the mob turned, as we all know, on those brave boys and girls, and it prevented them from entering school. Little Rock seethed, and throughout the day, Ike shuttled back and forth between Washington and Little Rock. He ended the day on a relaxing note, though he and Mamie watched a movie. Get this, Song of the South. By Tuesday, again, as we were all reminded this morning, the situation had deteriorated even further. The mayor begged for help, the mayor of Little Rock begged for help, and Eisenhower at that point realized he had no choice. He dispatched the 101st Airborne, the same units he had used to soften the beaches at Normandy, and those soldiers did, in fact, restore order. The integration of Little Rock High School, or of Central High School in Little Rock, as we all know, was a triumphant moment and a noble struggle. And Eisenhower played an instrumental, an indispensable role in achieving it. But was he motivated by the ambitions of that struggle? I don't think so. Indeed, for what motivated Ike in this issue, we can really turn directly to his own words. Here's what he said from the White House at 9 p.m. on September 24th, 1957. As you know, the Supreme Court of the United States has decided that separate public educational facilities for the races are inherently unequal and therefore compulsory school segregation laws are unconstitutional. Our personal opinions about the decision have no bearing on the matter of enforcement. The responsibility and authority of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution are very clear. Local federal courts were instructed by the Supreme Court to issue such orders and decrees as might be necessary to achieve admission to public schools without regard to race and with all deliberate speed, end quote. Ike's position then at Little Rock was essentially the same as his position in the immediate aftermath of Brown. It was not that he welcomed desegregation, but that his duty was to obey and enforce the law. For Faubus, Little Rock was about race. For Eisenhower, Little Rock was about power. But let me conclude, though, with an observation. Recognizing that Ike was conflicted about this issue only makes him more interesting and in some ways no less admirable. Here was a man who did not have instinctive sympathy for the urgency of civil rights, and yet nevertheless gave it force and support because he knew his duty demanded it, and he refused to shirk his duty. John Eisenhower, Ike's son, met with me several years ago in a long session to talk about his dad. And he emphasized to me then that his father neither sought nor won the presidency because he was interested in advancing social change. He was not a social reformer, John told me. He was a commander-in-chief. He also was a compassionate leader and a highly shrewd manager. He wanted to move slowly on civil rights, but when action was required, he deployed it with skill and resolve. The result is something really fairly extraordinary in American history. In the end, Dwight Eisenhower managed to create a presidency whose record on the preeminent social issue of its day was better than the instincts of the president himself. That is no small feat. It's why he does deserve our respect, despite his limitations. I thank you all very much for listening. I look forward to Dave's presentation.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'm very pleased to now introduce our next presenter, Dr. Dave Nichols. Dr. Nichols is a presidential historian and a leading authority on the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. His award-winning book on President Eisenhower and civil rights is entitled A Matter of Justice, Eisenhower and the Beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution. A native of Kansas, he received his PhD in history from the College of William and Mary, and his dissertation entitled Lincoln and the Indians, Civil War, Policy and Politics was reissued as a paperback book by the University of Illinois Press in 2000 and republished in 2012 this year. He's spoken across the nation about the Eisenhower presidency and launched the publication of his book on Eisenhower and civil rights at the Clinton Presidential Library in 2007. He is a distinguished scholar and teacher and a wonderful person with us today. Please welcome Dr. David Nichols.
Professor Ogletree, thank you so much. I always hate mistakes. Those of you who are able to get the handout that's out there, there's an error on about the second paragraph, and it should say after the Brown decision, Ike appointed 4 pro-desegregation. Yeah, proofreading is an awful thing. Goodness. So it's good to be with you, distinguished friends, colleagues, especially those of you of the Little Rock 9, and Ken Black for your work on those wonderful lawyers. I write about stubborn old white men, stubborn old white male politicians. You know, but I have an African-American daughter, and she and I know that you are the real war heroes for us. And I know that, and in his own way, Ike knew it too. And Jim Newton, who wrote a review of my Suez book, an author would kill for. It was wonderful. a dear man, and I appreciate his willingness to engage in dialogue on this. Now, I'm going to take this rickety plane of mine back to the 1950s, and we need to check 3 pieces of baggage at the gate. And the first is my personal baggage, and it's election time, so I suppose I must assert that I am not a shill for the Republican Party. I have a son named for John Kennedy. I marched with Martin Luther King, and I was a delegate to the Battle of Chicago in 1968. Does that take care of that? And neither am I shill for the Democrats, nor a lawyer, nor a legal expert. And now it reminds me, wasn't it Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate who said, "Who am I? Why am I here?" I'm here because I'm a scholar who tries never to put a phrase in a book that is not rooted in a document or in compelling circumstantial evidence. Now, the second piece of baggage that we need to check is our love affair with the 1960s. Folks, to quote Joe Biden, folks, the 50s were not the 60s. In January 1953, there was no mass movement in the streets. The Brown decision had not been made. Civil rights legislation had not been passed. And JFK and LBJ had not gotten religion on the subject yet. In January 1953, to give you a sense of what it was like, a black visitor from Boston would have not been able to get a hotel room, a meal, attend a movie, find a restroom, or get a drink of water in downtown Washington, D.C. in January 1953. It's a long story, but thanks to Dwight Eisenhower, by the end of that year, that was mostly all gone. And the Eisenhower legacy has been severely distorted by our obsession with looking at it through the prism of the 1960s. But the final piece of the baggage is Ike's personal style, and Jim is quite on target about a lot of that. Yes, civil rights was not Eisenhower's comfort zone, especially compared to foreign policy. He did not understand, I think, how brutal it was to be black in America, not in his gut. He did not owe his election to African Americans. And yes, he leaned on Herbert Brownell for advice, and in many respects was not as liberal as Brownell. I'll grant all that. But Ike had a powerful commitment to equality before the law. And a key we must understand is how Eisenhower made decisions, how he gave marching orders to his subordinates. Ike, the boss, was not the smiling grandfather that he paraded in public. He would grill his subordinates about every conceivable issue related to a big decision. And the quotes that historians often cite to prove Eisenhower's lack of commitment to civil rights are largely cherry-picked out of that decision-making context. With Eisenhower, you must not just look at what he said in the middle of a decision-making process, but you need to look at where he lands. That explains much of the complications that Jim was talking about. Yes, Ike disdained the bully pulpit. He had not won the war in Europe by making speeches. But that does not justify the conclusion. Well, if he didn't say it, he didn't do it. Whatever Eisenhower said or did not say, that is no excuse for my profession ignoring what he did. And here's what he did, much too briefly. It's better on the handout if you don't want to listen. Eisenhower desegregated the District of Columbia, something Harry Truman had not done. And as a candidate on September 8th, 1952, Eisenhower pledged to eliminate, quote, the last vestige of segregation in the nation's capital. And he largely kept that promise. Now, the textbooks tell us that Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces. Yes, Truman issued an executive order in 1948, but 4 years later, most combat units were still segregated. Thanks to Eisenhower, by October 30th, 1954, a year and a half after he came into office, not a single segregated combat unit remained. And the VA, Southern bases, and other agencies had been desegregated. Ike deserves a place with Truman in the textbooks because together they made the armed forces the most integrated institution in American life. Ike appointed the first black executive to the White House, E. Frederick Morrill. Yes, the Morrill appointment looks like tokenism to us modern people, but no previous president had done that. He made other important pro-civil rights appointments. Above all, Jim and I agree, above all, Herbert Brownell, I think one of the great attorney generals in our history. Eisenhower proposed, fought for, signed, and implemented the first civil rights legislation in 82 years. Weak as it was, the 1957 Civil Rights Act laid the groundwork for the watershed legislation of 1964-65, which, by the way, as a post-presidency, Eisenhower actively urged Republicans to support, and he gave Republican candidate Barry Goldwater fits behind the scenes on his negative vote. The myth, and this is wading into deep water, the myth is that the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was Lyndon Johnson's triumph. In fact, Johnson voted consistently with the segregationists to gut that bill. Johnson did not propose the legislation. I'm saying something very obvious. He did not. Eisenhower did. And it included Part 3, which gave the Attorney General authority to sue in federal court to protect civil rights, including school desegregation. But Richard Russell and Johnson torpedoed that provision, and they forced Ike to choose between dropping Part 3 or no bill at all. And Eisenhower, I think, wisely chose to break the legislative law's jam, a decision that was endorsed by Martin Luther King. But at that moment, the Southern segregationists in the Congress lost their historic stranglehold on civil rights legislation. And thanks to Eisenhower, more Republicans than the Democrats voted for the bill. The 60 positive votes, 37 of them Republican. That's LBJ's master of the Senate stuff. Anyway, but this is a law school, so let's discuss Eisenhower's judicial appointments for a few moments. Now, let's be clear. I don't mean to be too facetious, but Earl Warren did not appoint himself. Ike did it. Herbert Brownell recalled that promising Warren the first vacancy in the court was indeed Eisenhower's idea, not his. And yes, Jim's right, when the Chief Justice position came open, Ike hesitated. But I repeat, don't judge Eisenhower by what he says during the process of decision-making. Look at where he lands. And he landed on Earl Warren, a man he knew, and I'll say this again, despite all you've read otherwise, a man he knew was liberal on race. Eisenhower's implementation of that decision was breathtaking. He announced the nomination on Wednesday, September 30th, made it a recess appointment, and Warren took his seat the following Monday, October 5th. As a result, Warren was free to begin immediately working on Brown, although Warren was not confirmed by the Senate until March 1st, 1954. Now, true, Herbert Brownell recommended 3 more nominees to the Supreme Court, but I do not find any evidence that Eisenhower was casual about them. He resisted enormous pressure to nominate a Southerner for the first opening after the Brown decision, and instead he nominated John Marshall Harlan II. Yes, a Brownell recommendation. John Marshall Harlan II was the namesake and the grandson of the only negative vote in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson. And you don't think the segregationists didn't know what that meant? They got the message. And when Harlan's nomination was initially derailed, Eisenhower resubmitted it again and again. Once Ike made a judicial nomination, he refused to back off. He fought for them. You can duplicate that with nomination after nomination. The next recess appointment was William Brennan, hardly a right-winger, and Charles Evans Whitaker and Potter Stewart, Ike's third recess appointment, made after William Rogers succeeded Brownell as Attorney General. Keep that in mind. Ike championed Stewart's appointment, Potter Stewart's appointment, during a 4-month struggle with the Senate. And Stewart is the guy who said to the Senate Judiciary Committee, if you think I am dedicated to overturning Brown. I will tell you I am not. Eisenhower refused to appoint known segregationists to the lower courts, but John F. Kennedy, my son's namesake, when he took office, appointed segregationists right and left. Eisenhower appointed courageous judges to the Fourth and Fifth Circuits in the South. A great example is Frank Johnson. Frank Johnson spent 44 years on the bench. In 1956, Johnson struck down segregated seating in the Montgomery, Alabama buses after Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. And in 1965, Johnson cleared the way for Martin Luther King's entourage to march from Selma to Montgomery, spurring the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Herbert Brownell, in his memoirs, recalled that, and I quote, President Eisenhower took an unusual interest in judicial appointments, unquote. As Ike wrote to his brother Edgar, and this is on the back of your handout, the lawyers of this country, this is Ike, the lawyers of this country have not come to understand that I do not consider federal judgeships as included in the list of appointments subject to patronage, unquote. Eisenhower and Brownell actually depoliticized the judicial nomination process by removing it from the White House where Truman had kept it, and by instituting American Bar Association approval of nominees. But this was not, I repeat, not Eisenhower taking himself out of the decision-making process. The evidence for that is what happened after Herb Brownell left office. No change. When William Rogers succeeded Brownell as Attorney General, General Eisenhower warned him in writing, and this is on the back of the handout, quote, I have always taken a deep personal interest in the appointment of federal judges. For this reason, I should like that before you submit a formal nomination for signature, you drop in to confer with me about the matter. When Rogers failed to follow through, Ike formally reprimanded him with a letter and a conference in January of 1959. And the biggest humiliation of all for Rogers was pretty chummy with Jim Eastland, the Mississippi chair of the Judiciary Committee. And they worked out a deal where they would add 25 judgeships that would do all the civil rights cases they really needed. They worked out a deal. And to do that, and Eisenhower had finally agreed that half of the 25, that's 12 and a half, I don't know how you do that, but anyway, half of them could be Democrats. But he put a condition on it, that they, regardless of party, needed to be, quote, the best qualified candidates. And Lyndon Johnson and Jim Eastland knew what that meant. No segregationists. And they killed the deal. And Rogers had to crowfish out of it because the president had, in effect, vetoed it. I know that for a fact. I talked with Lawrence Walsh personally, who helped negotiate that deal. I assure you that's what happened. Finally, in 1957, when Governor Oglethorpe deployed the National Guard in Little Rock, Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne into Little Rock. Little Rock is the tip of the Eisenhower judicial iceberg. The court order to desegregate Central High School was issued by Judge Ronald Davies. Now, who do you think appointed Ronald Davies? Sure, you bet. Now, the charge that Eisenhower acted indecisively in Little Rock is absurd on the face of it. What is indecisive, folks, about sending troops sporting fixed bayonets into a former Confederate state? Of course he wanted to avoid it. What president wouldn't want to avoid it? It is equally inaccurate to say that Eisenhower had no choice but to send in troops. If keeping order in Little Rock was the issue, Governor Faubus and the Arkansas National Guard would have kept order, but they would have not desegregated the school. In fact, Eisenhower decided up front about the possibility of using troops. And on September 4th, 1957, stick with me on this, Faubus sends the deploys the National Guard on the 3rd. On the 4th, Herbert Brownell makes a statement to the press in which he ticks off all the things the president could do. And then the last one he says is, quote, "The president could use federal troops or the National Guard units of any state to enforce the court order." This statement was issued explicitly with the approval of the president 1 day after Faubus sent the Guard in. And on September 5th, the next day, in response to a telegram from Faubus, Eisenhower wired him, quote, "The federal Constitution will be upheld by me by every legal means at my command." And Herb Brownell and Dwight Eisenhower had long ago agreed that that legal means included troops. And in fact, the July 17th episode that Jim talks about in the news conference, that's what Eisenhower said. He had the authority. So is the glass half full or half empty on that? If he says, I have the authority, I just can't imagine any circumstances where somebody will be so dumb as to make me do it. There's an implied threat. The segregationists hung on every word about this guy. They understood that subtlety was his thing, but not when he was in charge. Senator Herman Talmadge said it so well. Eisenhower, he said, after all, was a general. A professional politician might have backed down, but not Ike. When he called in federal troops to desegregate the school, we knew he meant business. And what Eisenhower said in his speech after sending troops, well, we're running short on time. He said just what Jim said. He swore pretty much the same thing he said right after the Brown decision. But those words, Eisenhower saying that whenever necessary, the means at the president's command, he quotes those exact same words on August 20th, 1958, after the 8th Circuit Court rules on Cooper v. Aarron. He quotes those exact words to say, in effect, again, to the Southerners, he would use troops again if he needed to. In fact, he said, I feel exactly as I did a year ago. And after the Cooper v. Aaron Supreme Court decision, he says this, and this quote's on the back of your handout. "We must never forget that the rights of all of us depend upon respect for the lawfully determined rights of each of us. As one nation, we must assure to all our people, whatever their color or creed, the enjoyment of their constitutional rights and the full measure of the law's protection. We must be faithful to our constitutional ideals and go forward in good faith with the unremitting task of translating them into reality." So if somebody wants to tell you Eisenhower never spoke out about Supreme Court decisions, include this one, not just May 17th, 54. He was a first-term politician. You know what those guys do. They trim a lot. I mean, that happens. Not now, of course. But anyway, the main sources of the Eisenhower controversy, forgive me, I'm taking a little longer than I intended, but we need to get to those. Before Brown, Eisenhower desegregated dozens of federally controlled schools for military dependents in the South. The Brown decision was announced on May 17th, 1954. The next day, he ordered the commissioners of the District of Columbia to develop a plan for desegregation that would be a model for the nation, and they had one in 1 week. Does anything happen in 1 week in Washington now? You think they didn't think he meant business? 2 days later, then he makes the statement that Jim quoted. The Supreme Court has spoken, and I've sworn to uphold the constitutional processes in the country, and I will obey. Now, it's hardly a ringing moral endorsement, but I've increasingly come to treat this statement as a soldierly statement of duty. And if so, it means more to a soldier. And I have challenged, and I'll challenge you, people all across the United States to give me one statement of positive praise for the Brown decision in the months following, not 10 years later, in the months following, by Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, or Lyndon B. Johnson. If you can find one, let me know. I've searched endlessly. I've not been able to find it. The only thing I find is people find statements in the 60s that read backward. Eisenhower, why didn't he say more publicly? I think he honestly believed in separation of powers and that the president shouldn't comment on Supreme Court decisions. I think he believed that Southerners would respond more to a call for obeying the law. But I have to talk for just a few moments about the Stag Dinner story, because that's the linchpin. And Jim read it to you. I'm not going to read those awful words to you again. You know, they are awful. I can't excuse them. You know, people generally assume, and my profession has assumed, that if the Chief Justice said it, it must be true. Now, look, nothing I say here or we say here can diminish Earl Warren's stature. His judicial achievements are monumental, especially the unanimous ruling in Brown. But this story has generally dominated. So many of my colleagues have said, well, if he said that, nothing else matters. I'm sorry, that's not adequate. In the 1950s, white men often said such things. That's true. But why did Warren decide to highlight this story? Obviously, to paint Eisenhower as a racist. But more important, to claim that Eisenhower was lobbying him against overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. And please note that in his memoirs, Warren gives no credit to Eisenhower for the 4 other appointments to his own bench or to his appointments to the federal courts. And when Eisenhower sent troops into Little Rock, Earl Warren said nothing. In my view, Warren's contention that Ike was lobbying against Brown is simply not credible. Why not? Because we can document, this is not in the book. If I would do an edition, it will be. We can document that Eisenhower and Herbert Brownell had agreed on the tenor of the government's brief to Brown months earlier. And Brownell, by the way, was in attendance at that dinner. It was not a big bunch of people. It was about 11 people. So they were all within hearing range. You know, it was a stag dinner. What can I say? It was the 50s. But they had agreed. On August 19th, 1953, Eisenhower and Brownell agreed that Brownell would present a brief calling for the overthrow of Plessy v. Ferguson. Yes, typically Ike raised every single issue he could think of, and so again, historians cherry pick out of that conversation, but you have to look at where he lands, and Brownell himself says he landed on saying, go ahead. And at his November 16th, 1953 news conference, just before Brownell was to submit his brief to the court, a reporter asked the president if he was going to consult with the Attorney General about his brief, and he said, indeed, if he consults with him, he said, indeed I do. We confer regularly, and this subject comes along with others, constantly. Brownell submitted it on November 27th, and on December 2nd, Brownell informed the president that Chief Justice Warren had told him that the brief was outstanding. I think that's proof positive that Ike knew the content of the brief, and probably Brownell got his word from Warren because they were pretty close. And that means that Warren knew that Ike knew. And finally, in a much misunderstood conversation, on January 25th, 1954, Brownell called Ike to tell him in confidence that he had heard, almost surely from Warren, that the court might decide the constitutionality of Plessy this spring, but put off remedies for the next year. Remedies meant enforcement. It was not about the constitutional issue. If you read any book that tells you otherwise, it's not correct. Eisenhower and Brownell already assumed that Plessy would be struck down. And Eisenhower, by the way, did an extraordinary thing and personally edited the Brown II brief that the government presented. We know that for sure. He personally edited. And he left in place, out of that editing, a requirement, if the government's case had been taken by the court, a requirement that the courts give school districts 90 days to present a desegregation plan. Now, the court didn't do that, as you know. You know what they did? They said desegregation could proceed with, what's the phrase? All deliberate speed. And Brownell and Eisenhower were never happy with that. Eisenhower signed off on and edited a brief that was much tougher. And by February 8th, the date of the stag dinner, in other words, Dwight Eisenhower and Herb Brownell had long since agreed on their stance before the court. And so Brownell, it just is not credible that Ike was lobbying him on that matter. So that, all too briefly, is the case for Eisenhower. He was not a saint, nor did he deeply understand how much oppressed African Americans needed a word of encouragement from their president. I wish he'd done that. He didn't. But I'll say to you again, there's no excuse for ignoring what he did. This was the 1950s, not the 1960s. And I will say to you that in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower was demonstrably more progressive on civil rights than Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, or John F. Kennedy. Ike later put it in an interview. He said, if there was anything good done, they mostly want to prove that it was somebody else that did it and that I went along as a passenger. Well, Dwight Eisenhower was no passenger. Most of the time, he was in the driver's seat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nichols. You can see there's a different point of view in history about Dwight Eisenhower, and I think we've been incredibly well educated. We have time for a couple of questions. The microphones are